Between the 1970s and well into the new century, I've embarked on a number of journeys across the Australian mainland. It was during those road trips I came to appreciate the country's history and unforgiving landscape. Finding places that have not changed is becoming increasingly difficult. You have to drive a long way from civilization before you find an area that doesn't change, or not in a hurry anyway. Mungo National Park is by far one of my favourite places to visit in New South Wales. The first time I ventured into this part of the country was in 1986 and was so impressed that over the next few decades I returned many times. It has been documented that the first humans arrived in Australia from Southeast Asia, probably around 65,000 years ago, and over the centuries they have spread out across the continent. If we time-slip back 150,000 years ago, the near-constant winds across inland Australia have been coming mainly from the west for millions of years. This has had a major influence on the Willandra Lake system. Those western winds helped to create the shallow basins in which lakes formed. Lake Mungo lies within that system. About 60,000 years ago, the lake began to fill as water from the ancestral Lachlan River flowed down the Willandra Creek. It was during this time period that this area was graced with an abundant water supply. At its peak, Lake Mungo had a surface area of around 200 square kilometres and was up to 15 metres deep in some places. The influence of those western winds again came into play as sand blew off the wave-formed beaches on the eastern margins of the lake and began to develop the lunette ridges. Over the next 20,000 years, the climate remained stable. Within the dunes, plant life grew and woodland vegetation flourished on the lunettes and the surrounding countryside. With a healthy ecosystem and abundant wildlife, about 45,000 years ago, Aboriginals had begun to occupy the shores of the lake. Hints of this have been unearthed by the wind, revealing stone tools such as knives and axes, grindstones and even middens of mussel shells, which were cast aside after meals. In the bush that surrounded the lake, they hunted the megafauna, which came in the form of larger versions of modern native birds and animals. In 1968, the cremated remains of Mungo Lady were discovered by geologist John Bowler. Those remains have since been dated as being 42,000 years old. Burial places of their ancestors hold a special interest for Aboriginal people, who put great importance on being laid to rest in one's own country. This form of ritual burial is believed to be the oldest known cremation in the world and maybe the earliest evidence of modern man's spiritual beliefs. Mungo Man was uncovered in 1974 by the same geologist. This time the remains have been dated at 62,000 years old, which, if correct, indicated that the Aboriginals lived in this area even before the lake provided a sustainable existence. Mungo Man has proved to be the oldest human remains in Australia and could be the oldest modern human discovered outside of Africa. He led a hard life as a hunter-gatherer and died around the age of 50. His tribe carefully buried him in the lunette. He was discovered lying on his back with his hands crossed in his lap and sprinkled with red ochre. It has been documented that this ritual could be the oldest known example of such a burial in the world. The recovery and management of the remains of ancestors is an issue of great sensitivity to Aboriginal people. Many remains, both ancient and modern, have been taken and studied without permission. Some were sent overseas and kept in collections. This is still a controversial issue today, and not all remains have been returned to their country and people. But the remains of Mungo Lady and Mungo Man have now been returned to their burial places. But you cannot visit the secret location today, because it has been covered by sand at the request of the Aboriginal elders. The same can be said about the 2003 discovery of Aboriginal footprints found in the lunette, belonging to what appears to be a group of Aboriginal hunters crossing a damp clay pan. They have been dated at being 20,000 years old. To date, they are the only footprints of that age in Australia, and arguably the most numerous yet found anywhere in the world. 40,000 years ago, water levels in the Willandra lakes began to recede and became salty. Over time, the water level fluctuated with the changing climate, until about 18,000 years ago, Mungo Lake gradually dried out. Starting in the south and moving progressively north, the lake never fills again.
Dunes here are heading towards the east all the time, and they're slowly moving into the bush, and it's quite interesting to see the way everything is moving this way, following the winds.
In 1992, I followed a 60-kilometre loop track around the eastern section of the sand dunes. As 1/3 of the loop was completed, I set up camp for the night. There was one other party sharing the camping ground. Unlike me, Dean and Abe were experienced outback travellers, and we were soon conversing about life on the road. I continued negotiating the well-maintained sandy track that sneaked through light scrub of mallee trees. At one section, I managed to get some video of the car parked between the sand dunes. For the next hour, I explored the dunes. Europeans arrived in the area in the 1840s, bringing with them sheep and cattle. This new occupation resulted in the native vegetation being reduced by the grazing of those animals. In the 1880s, overgrazing, along with the arrival of rabbits and a severe drought, combined to shock the ecosystem, and it never recovered. Although the moving sand dunes have been here for a very long time. I was amazed to see the many animal tracks from the night before. Whenever an interesting view presented itself, the SLR camera was brought into service. In 1874, Robert Patterson, a Victorian pastoralist, purchased a number of leases in the area. His latest acquisitions included Zanzi Station, which was added to the expanding Golgol Station.
In 1921, the Golgol Station was broken up under the soldier settlement scheme that followed the First World War. This process created several new stations, including Zanzi Station. Joseph Vega acquired the land as part of that scheme. The Homestead Chimney is one of the few reminders of the infrastructure that was once here. This underground dugout was built to counteract the oppressive summer heat.
This is definitely the coolest place to be on a hot day. This is exactly what this place was used for. The Vega family built this dugout to escape the hot temperatures of the summer. We're not the hottest summer now, but it's pretty warm outside and it's nice and cool in here.
This is one of the guys I shared last night's campsite with.
In 1880, Robert Patterson was adding yet another property to his growing empire when he purchased the nearby Mungo Station.
He started construction on the boundary fences that same year, so it's not unreasonable to believe that work was also started on the woolshed around about the same time. The shed was originally built with provision for 30 blade shearers and has internal holding pens. Beneath these pens are the underfloor holding pens, which were built to keep the sheep dry prior to shearing. In 1886, the shed had a high output with over 29,000 sheep going through the pens. In 1888, the shed was converted to mechanical shearing.
The gravel track became a rocky track. My progress was slow and I had to engage four-wheel drive as I edged my car around a number of fair-sized boulders that lay on the track.